What happens when Hollywood royalty meets actual royalty and the gloves come off? You're about to witness one of the most explosive celebrity interviews ever recorded, where a simple question about family loyalty spiraled into a verbal battle that left one guest storming off stage and millions of viewers stunned. This is the untold story of how Meghan Markle and Drew Barrymore went from friendly chatter to all-out war in front of a live studio audience. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment, because this story will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about celebrity interviews. The Drew Barrymore Show was supposed to be a safe space, a warm embrace where celebrities could let their guard down and share intimate stories. Drew had built her reputation on creating those magical moments where stars felt comfortable enough to cry, laugh, and reveal their authentic selves. But on this particular afternoon, as Meghan Markle settled into the plush cream-colored chair, across from Drew, the energy in the studio felt different. The usual warmth was replaced by an underlying tension that even the audience could sense. "Meghan, thank you so much for being here," Drew began, her signature smile beaming across the intimate set. "I have to say, you look absolutely radiant. Motherhood and life in California are clearly treating you well." Meghan smoothed her elegant navy blazer and returned the smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you, Drew. It's wonderful to be here. I've always admired your show and how you create such a genuine space for conversation." The pleasantries continued for several minutes, touching on Meghan's recent projects and her adjustment to life outside the royal spotlight. Drew's questions were carefully crafted, designed to ease her guest into deeper territory without triggering any defensive responses. The audience was engaged, leaning forward in their seats as they watched two powerful women navigate the delicate dance of celebrity interview protocol. "You know, Meghan, I've been thinking a lot about family lately," Drew said, her voice taking on that vulnerable quality that made her interviews so compelling, especially after my own experiences with my mother and the complicated relationships we sometimes have with the people who are supposed to protect us. I imagine that resonates with you on some level. Meghan's posture shifted slightly, her hands clasping together in her lap. "Family is incredibly important to me, Drew. I think everyone deserves to be surrounded by people who love and support them unconditionally." "Absolutely," Drew nodded enthusiastically. "And I think that's what makes your story so compelling to so many people. You made this incredibly brave decision to step away from a situation that wasn't serving you or your family. That takes real courage." The compliments seemed to relax Meghan momentarily, and she offered a more genuine smile. "Thank you for saying that. It wasn't an easy decision, but sometimes you have to prioritize your own well-being and the well-being of those you love most." Drew leaned forward slightly, her eyes sparkling with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. "I'm curious about something, though, and I hope this isn't too personal. When you make a decision like that to step away from family, how do you handle the guilt? Because I imagine there must be some part of you that wonders if you could have tried harder to make it work." The question hung in the air like smoke, and Meghan's expression began to change. Her smile faltered for just a moment before she composed herself. "I don't think it's helpful to frame it as stepping away from family, Drew. I think it's more accurate to say that Harry and I chose to step away from an institution that wasn't allowing us to thrive as individuals or as a family unit." "Right, of course," Drew said quickly, sensing the shift in energy. "I didn't mean to imply. I just meant that when you have family members who maybe don't understand your choices, it can create this internal conflict. Like, do you ever find yourself missing the simplicity of just being able to call your dad or your sister and have everything be okay?" Meghan's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "Drew, I think there's an important distinction to make here. Some relationships are complicated because of misunderstandings or hurt feelings that can be worked through. Other relationships are complicated because they're fundamentally toxic or damaging. It's important not to confuse the two." The audience seemed to sense the temperature change in the room. Drew's usual warmth was meeting something harder, more defensive in Meghan. But Drew, ever the professional, pressed on with what she probably thought was empathy. "I hear you. I really do. And I'm not trying to minimize your experience at all. I guess what I'm struggling with is this idea that sometimes, even when relationships are really difficult, there's still love there. Like with my own mother, our relationship was incredibly complicated and painful. But I still found ways to maintain connection, because underneath all the dysfunction, there was still this thread of love. Meghan's composure was beginning to crack, though she was fighting hard to maintain her media-trained exterior. I appreciate you sharing your experience, Drew, but I think you're making some assumptions about my situation that aren't necessarily accurate. Not every family dynamic is the same, and not every relationship is worth preserving, regardless of the cost. No, you're absolutely right, Drew said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. I guess I'm just someone who believes that family is family, you know, and that sometimes we have to be willing to be the bigger person, even when it's hard. The words hit Meghan like a physical blow. Her carefully maintained composure slipped entirely, and for a moment, the audience saw something raw and unguarded. In her expression, "be the bigger person," she repeated, her voice rising slightly. Drew, with all due respect, I don't think you understand what you're suggesting. Drew seemed momentarily taken aback by the sharp edge in Meghan's voice, but she quickly recovered, her media instincts kicking in. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to upset you. I'm just trying to understand as someone who's also dealt with family challenges. No, Drew, I think you need to hear this, Meghan said, her voice steady, but with an underlying intensity that made the studio audience shift uncomfortably in their seats. When you suggest that someone should be the bigger person, you're essentially asking them to continue accepting unacceptable behavior for the sake of maintaining relationships that are fundamentally harmful. Drew's smile wavered, but she maintained her composure. I understand that, and I'm not suggesting anyone should tolerate abuse or harmful behavior. But sometimes, don't you think there's a difference between cutting people off completely and maybe just setting boundaries while still leaving room for healing? Boundaries. Meghan's voice rose another notch. Drew, do you know what boundaries look like when you're dealing with people who have access to global media platforms? Do you know what boundaries look like when someone can literally influence international headlines about your character, your parenting, your marriage? The audience was completely silent now, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. Drew's usual warmth was being met with something fierce and uncompromising from Meghan, and neither woman seemed willing to back down. I can't imagine how difficult that must be, Drew said carefully. But at the same time, isn't there something to be said for taking the high road? For being the person who chooses love over conflict, even when it's hard? Meghan laughed, but there was no humor in it. The high road? Drew, you're sitting here suggesting that I should have continued to subject myself and my children to a toxic environment because taking the high road is somehow more noble than protecting my family. That's not wisdom. That's enabling. Drew's professional facade was beginning to crack. I'm not suggesting you should have stayed in a toxic environment. I'm suggesting that maybe there were other options besides completely cutting ties with your family. My family? Meghan's voice was sharp now, cutting through the studio air like a blade. Drew, let me ask you something. If someone spent years trying to undermine your marriage, if they actively worked to damage your reputation, if they showed no interest in having a relationship with your children, would you still call them family? Well, Drew started, but Meghan wasn't finished. Because that's what you're asking me to do. You're asking me to prioritize a label over actual behavior. You're asking me to value the idea of family more than the reality of how those people actually treated me and my husband. Drew straightened in her chair, her own defenses rising. Meghan, I think you're misunderstanding what I'm trying to say. I'm not asking you to tolerate bad behavior. I'm asking whether you think there might have been ways to address the issues without completely severing relationships. Address the issues. Meghan's composure was completely gone now, replaced by a raw honesty that was both compelling and uncomfortable to witness. Drew, how do you address issues with people who refuse to acknowledge that issues exist? How do you address problems with people who are more interested in protecting their own image than in actually resolving conflict? The tension in the studio was palpable. Camera operators continued filming, but even they seemed uncertain about whether they should be capturing this moment. Drew's producers were likely scrambling behind the scenes, trying to decide whether to intervene or let the confrontation play out. I think, Drew said slowly, that sometimes we have to be willing to make the first move toward reconciliation, even when we feel like we're the ones who've been wronged. The first move. Meghan's voice was incredulous. Drew, you're assuming I didn't try? You're assuming that I didn't spend years trying to build bridges, trying to find common ground, trying to make things work. You're assuming that I just woke. up one day and decided to burn everything down for no reason. I'm not assuming anything, Drew said, though her tone suggested otherwise. I'm just saying that sometimes, when we're hurt, we can make decisions that we might regret later. And I'm wondering if there's a part of you that wishes things could have been different. Of course I wish things could have been different, Meghan snapped. I wish I could have had a father who was proud of me, instead of one who sold stories about me to the tabloids. I wish I could have had in-laws who welcomed me instead of ones who seemed determined to make my life miserable. I wish I could have had a sister-in-law who was interested in building a relationship, instead of one who seemed to view me as competition. The specificity of Meghan's complaints seemed to catch Drew off guard. This wasn't the vague, diplomatic language typically used in celebrity interviews. This was raw, specific, and deeply personal. I hear your pain, Drew said, her voice softer now. And I'm not trying to minimize it, but don't you think that sometimes when we're in pain, we can see malice where there might have just been misunderstanding or poor communication? Poor communication? Meghan's voice was rising again. Drew, poor communication is when someone forgets to return your phone call. Poor communication is when someone misunderstands your intentions. Poor communication is not when someone actively works to destroy your reputation while smiling to your face. Drew was clearly struggling now, caught between her instinct to de-escalate and her apparent belief that reconciliation was always possible. I just think that families are complicated, and sometimes we have to be willing to forgive, even when we feel like we haven't received the apology we deserve. Forgive. Meghan stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the studio floor. Drew, you're asking me to forgive people who have never asked for forgiveness? You're asking me to forgive people who continue to harm me and my family, even now? You're asking me to forgive people who would rather see me destroyed than admit they were wrong? The studio fell into complete silence as Meghan stood, her chest rising and falling with barely controlled emotion. Drew remained seated, looking up at her guest with a mixture of concern and confusion. The audience could feel the energy shift, as if everyone in the room knew they were witnessing something that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. Meghan, please sit down, Drew said gently, gesturing to the chair. I think we're both getting a little heated here, and that's not what either of us wants. No, Drew, I think I need to stand for this, Meghan replied, her voice steady but intense, because I think you need to understand something. You keep talking about forgiveness and reconciliation like they're moral imperatives, but you're ignoring the fundamental question of whether the people involved are actually interested in change. Drew shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Understand that change is important, but sometimes we have to model the behavior we want to see. Sometimes we have to be willing to extend grace even when it hasn't been earned. Grace! Meghan's voice cracked slightly. Drew, I extended grace for years. I extended grace when my father staged paparazzi photos right before my wedding. I extended grace when family members gave interviews criticizing my character. I extended grace when I was treated like an outsider at family gatherings. I extended grace until I realized that my grace was being interpreted as weakness. The audience was transfixed. This wasn't the polished, media-trained Meghan they were used to seeing. This was someone speaking from a place of deep hurt and frustration, and the authenticity was both compelling and uncomfortable. I don't think grace is weakness, Drew said carefully. I think grace is strength. I think it takes incredible strength to keep loving people even when they hurt you. But that's exactly my point, Meghan said, her voice rising again. You're conflating love with acceptance of bad behavior. You're suggesting that real love means tolerating treatment that damages your mental health, your marriage, and your children's well-being. That's not love, Drew. That's codependency. Drew's expression hardened slightly. I think you're being unfair. I'm not suggesting you should tolerate abuse. I'm suggesting that sometimes when we're hurt, we can close our hearts to possibilities for healing that might exist. Possibilities for healing. Meghan's laugh was bitter. Drew, let me ask you something. If someone spent years treating you poorly, if they showed no genuine remorse, if they continued to behave in ways that harmed you even after you'd asked them to stop, at what point would you say, enough is enough? I think, Drew said slowly, that I would try to understand what was driving their behavior. I would try to see if there was pain or fear underneath their actions that I could help address. And if they didn't want your help, if they were perfectly happy continuing to treat you poorly, then I would limit my contact with them, but I wouldn't completely cut them out of my life. Why not? Meghan's question was sharp, direct. Drew seemed taken aback by the directness. Because they're family. Because relationships are complicated. Because I believe that people can change. But what if they don't want to change? Drew, what if they're comfortable with the dynamic exactly as it is? What if your continued presence in their life actually enables them to keep behaving badly because they know you'll always be there no matter what they do? The question hung in the air, and for a moment, Drew seemed genuinely stumped. Her usual quick responses and empathetic redirects weren't working against Meghan's logical progression. I guess, Drew said finally, I would still hold out hope that eventually they would come around. At what cost? Meghan's voice was quiet now, but it carried more weight than her earlier shouting. At the cost of your own mental health. At the cost of your marriage. At the cost of your children's well-being. At what point does hope become delusion? Drew's face flushed slightly. I don't think hope is ever delusion. I think hope is what makes us human. Hope without boundaries isn't hope, Drew. It's fantasy. And I refuse to sacrifice my family's well-being for your fantasy of what family relationships should look like. The words hit Drew like a physical blow. Her carefully constructed persona of warmth and understanding cracked completely, revealing something harder underneath. My fantasy, Meghan. I think you're projecting your own issues onto this conversation. My issues? Meghan's voice was incredulous. Drew, you've spent this entire interview trying to convince me that I should have continued subjecting myself to treatment that was damaging my mental health. You've suggested that my decision to protect my family was somehow selfish or wrong, and now you're telling me that I'm the one with issues? I never said your decision was selfish, Drew protested, but her voice lacked conviction. You didn't have to say it directly. You've been implying it with every question. You've been suggesting that a good person, a loving person, would have found a way to make it work. You've been suggesting that my inability to maintain those relationships says something negative about my character. Drew opened her mouth to respond, but Meghan wasn't finished. And the most insulting part is that you're doing this while sitting in your comfortable chair, having never experienced what I've experienced, having never had to make the choices I've had to make. You're judging decisions you've never had to face from a position of complete ignorance. The studio was so quiet that the hum of the cameras seemed loud. Drew's face was red now, a mixture of embarrassment and anger. I'm not judging you, Meghan. I'm trying to understand you. No, you're not trying to understand me. You're trying to fit me into your worldview about how families should work. You're trying to make me into a cautionary tale about the dangers of cutting people off instead of listening to what I'm actually telling you about why those decisions were necessary. That's not fair, Drew said, her voice rising for the first time. I've been nothing but supportive throughout this entire conversation. Supportive? Meghan's laugh was harsh. Drew, you've spent the last 30 minutes essentially telling me that I should have continued to accept unacceptable behavior because family is family. How is that supportive? Because I believe in the power of forgiveness and healing, Drew shot back. Because I believe that relationships can be repaired if both people are willing to do the work. Both people, Drew, both people. And that's exactly my point. You can't repair a relationship when only one person is willing to do the work. You can't heal a dynamic when the other person is committed to keeping things exactly as they are. Meghan reached for her purse, which had been sitting on the small table beside her chair. The gesture was small, but it sent a clear message. Drew's eyes widened as she realized what was happening. Meghan, please don't leave. I think we're making progress here. Meghan. Meghan slung her purse over her shoulder. Drew, this conversation has confirmed exactly why I made the choices I made. You're so invested in your idea of what family should be that you can't hear what I'm telling you about what my family actually was. I'm listening, Drew said desperately. I'm hearing you. I just think that maybe there's another way to look at this. There's always another way to look at things, Drew, but sometimes the other way is just another form of denial. Sometimes the other way is just another way of avoiding the hard truth that some relationships can't be fixed, no matter how much we want them to be. Meghan turned toward the exit, but then paused and looked back at Drew. I hope you never have to learn this lesson the hard way. I hope you never have to choose between your own well-being and your idealistic vision of what family should be. But if you do, I hope you'll remember this conversation and understand that sometimes walking away is the most loving thing you can do for everyone involved. With that, Meghan walked off the set, leaving Drew sitting alone in her chair, staring after her with a mixture of shock and confusion. The audience sat in stunned silence, unsure whether to applaud or simply process what they had just witnessed. The cameras continued rolling for several more seconds, capturing Drew's attempt to compose herself and find words that never came. It was a moment that would be dissected and analyzed for weeks to come. A reminder that even in the controlled environment of daytime television, real emotions and real conflicts could still break through. What did you think of this explosive confrontation? Did Drew push too far, or was Meghan too defensive? Drop a comment below with your thoughts and make sure to subscribe for more incredible celebrity stories that you won't see anywhere else.